So they've come up with this rather specious argument that the online platforms are stealing their news content by carrying links to it, which is not a very good argument at all because it's clearly covered under copyright law. The Berne Convention allows this, and so they've just made up that they've concocted this argument that the government fell for in Australia a few years ago, and they fell for it here in Canada. The only question becomes, will they fall for it in the UK?
The future of journalism is said to be in peril, as the internet has reduced advertising revenue and increased competition. In response, publishers have sought payments from large digital platforms such as Google and Meta's Facebook. But a new Canadian law to compel these transfers is backfiring, with Facebook blocking news and Google threatening to do the same. This affair raises fundamental questions about the value of news to digital platforms and the viability of journalism in the digital age. Welcome back to the IEA podcast. My name is Matthew Lesh and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Communications here at the IEA. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalizing policy question. Today's question: is the news industry broken? To discuss, I'm very excited to be joined by Marc Edge, who's a Canadian journalist, author, and academic. He's the author of 7 books, has taught at universities across 5 countries, as well as providing evidence to the UK news industry inquiry, the Cancross Review, in 2019. Marc, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So let's start with what's going on at the moment in Canada, because I think this is quite fascinating. Why is Meta, the owner of Facebook and Instagram, decided to begin blocking news for its Canadian users?
Well, they're blocking news because that's one way of complying with the new Online News Act, which was passed in June by Parliament here and will come into effect actually next month. So they kind of jumped the gun a little bit, but I think it was to make a point because if they continue to carry links to Canadian news stories, they'll be on the hook for tens of millions of dollars. The latest estimate was 62 million, and for Google, 160 million. And so Google is considering doing the same thing because, as in Australia, where a similar law was passed a few years ago, they can opt out, and by doing so, they're going to save tens or hundreds of millions of dollars.
So this is fascinating in a sense because the key premise of the digital platforms, the likes of I should say that the key premise of the news publishers has been the digital platforms like Google and Meta. They really need the news content for them to function, and that they're hugely revenue positive. Well, this seems to say is the opposite. It says perhaps the digital platforms don't need news as much as the news publishers might think that they do.
No, I don't think they do. Facebook, after all, is a social network. It's a place where people connect with their friends, and I'm sure discussing the news of the day is a small part of that, but it's a part that Meta can live without, and certainly for the price tag that the government and the publishers here in Canada are demanding, it seems that they will live without it.
Yeah, and I saw some interesting reporting. It was in Reuters suggesting that Meta's decision to block news hasn't actually reduced traffic to Facebook. So it isn't even having a massive impact on Facebook. But where it potentially could have a large impact is on the publishers, particularly, I suppose, smaller internet-based publishers who might be losing traffic from Facebook.
Yes, the publishers have rather shot themselves in the foot with lobbying for this law because now not only will they not be getting the hundreds of millions of dollars that they'd hoped for from Google and Facebook, and they'll probably lose the millions of dollars that they've already got coming in agreements with them because at least Meta will be canceling its and probably Google too, but they're also going to be losing all the traffic that once came from Facebook and probably from Google as well. And this is having a disproportionate effect, unfortunately, in Canada on the smaller online only publishers who rely especially on Facebook to build up an audience. So the whole thing is rather backfiring on them.
Yeah, we're in this bizarre situation where something that used to be entirely normal and uncontroversial, which is this idea of linking to each other's sites on the internet, has now become some kind of big deal. Now, the central claim from the publishers here is, well, some kind of payment is justified because effectively at one point, the copyright claim. I think subsequently it's become, there's some kind of significant benefit to the revenues of the digital platforms. Of course, I think a lot of the evidence points the other direction, which is, as I think you've just said there, that most of what people do on social media has nothing to do with news. And then inverse to that, most of what makes advertising revenue is not news on social media. It's things like clothing and jewelry sales, or trying to sell someone a travel package or something with direct financial benefit. It's not clear that there's much financial benefit when it comes to advertising from having that news content, though, is it?
No, I'm sure that Facebook could live very well without news. What the publishers are looking at, though, is the hundreds of millions of pounds that they're taking in every year in advertising because they've perfected target marketing through their use of big data, and newspapers can't compete with that. And so now something like 80% of all online advertising revenues goes to Google and Facebook. That used to go to the newspapers, and they want it back, or at least a portion of it. So they've come up with this rather specious argument that the the online platforms are stealing their news content by carrying links to it, which is not a very good argument at all because it's clearly covered under copyright law. The Berne Convention allows this, and so they've just made up that they've concocted this argument that the government fell for in Australia a few years ago, and they fell for it here in Canada. The only question becomes, will they fall for it in the UK?
Well, yeah, I think that this is currently a live debate, isn't it, as part of the UK's Digital Markets and Competition Bill, that it empowers the CMA to enter, require a fair dealing, and then ultimately enter a final negotiation, mandated final negotiation between the news publishers and the platforms that could then theoretically require them having to pay something, although ministers have said that, similar to Canada, the same thing could happen in the UK, which is that theoretically the platforms could pull out of providing news, which is not what anyone really wants here. It seems, though, to me like a lot of the target is kind of misplaced, in the sense that, and I'm interested in your view, as someone who's studied the news industry very closely. Effectively, it was maybe perhaps a supremely profitable industry for a period of time, particularly when it had the classifieds revenue. And that classified revenue has more or less kind of disappeared because it's so cheap to advertise goods for sale online. Maybe you could say eBay should be the target, or Craigslist. I think there was one study that said local newspaper revenues and coverage went down as Craigslist arrived in different places over time. It seems like there's a very broad set of new competitive pressures on the advertising side. Basically, people can go advertise elsewhere or advertise for free online their goods in a way they couldn't in the past, and they were forced to use newspapers.
Yes, this has been going on, for 30 years. As soon as the World Wide Web came into being, that was it really for the business model of newspapers, which has traditionally relied on advertising. And in the second half of the 20th century, in particular, there grew up what I call this advertising bubble, grew larger and larger and larger. And especially here in North America, publishers came to rely on advertising uh, more and more. In the U.S., I think it was as high as 88% of all newspaper revenues came from advertising before the recession of 2008, 2009. And in Canada, I think it was second highest in the world at about 78%. In most countries, it's more like 50-50, and in some, such as Japan, readers have traditionally paid about two-thirds of revenue. So publishers are just having to rearrange their business model to rely less on advertising, and they've been doing this quite successfully, increasing the cover prices of the print product, but also importantly online now, asking readers to pay to read the news online rather than giving it away for free, which, when you think about it, isn't really a very good business model at all.
Yeah, I think there's this interesting dichotomy here where there's a bit of a narrative that effectively that the internet has destroyed the news media, has destroyed journalism. Isn't it awful? But I suppose an obvious counter to that is, well, not only do we have more access to more information from more places than ever before, but it's also enabled a lot of new voices to be heard. I think of something like the rise of Substack, where a whole bunch of journalists have left mainstream media outlets and are now trying to sell their own wares. Or a lot of people who might never have been mainstream media journalists have now got an opportunity to have a platform and say something. So it seems like, in terms of maybe some of the older media companies aren't doing as well as they did during the advertising bubble you're talking about. But in terms of as a consumer of media, it literally couldn't be better than it is today.
Yes, exactly. It's been said that we're actually in a new golden age of journalism because we have at our fingertips access to news from around the world instantaneously. But the thing about the internet is it's a great global medium, but it's not a very good local medium, and it's been taking away revenues from local media. And this is something that should be redressed, and where government might have a role to play. And in fact, has been doing quite well in the UK with what's called the Local Democracy Reporters Program, which they use a portion of the BBC's budget to fund direct reporting of councils, local government. And a similar program was brought in here in Canada 5 years ago called the Local Journalism Initiative to help improve coverage in underserved communities. But then publishers caught wind of what Rupert Murdoch was asking for in Australia, and what he got, which was hundreds of millions, ordered by the government to be paid from Google and Facebook, although I believe that will be ending soon as the first round of 3 year contracts expires. I don't think they'll be renewed because Facebook, like I say, is getting out of the news business worldwide, it seems. But Google, their mandate is quite a bit broader. It's to know where everything is on the internet, and to exclude news from that would be quite a blow, not just to their business model, but also to consumers who've expected to be able to find anything on Google. But there are other search engines. There's Bing and Yahoo, something called DuckDuckGo. Uh, they're not nearly as efficient as Google, but they are competitors. So I don't know how publishers can claim that Google or Facebook have a monopoly, because they do have competitors. And it's rather ironic that the publisher's business model is being built on monopoly for decades.
Yeah, so there's an intriguing thing here where effectively what has happened in a political economy sense, which is you've got these very large incumbent companies in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, who have basically lobbied effectively governments for some kind of handout. I think you've made the point, in fact, you've written a blog post to the IEA where you do make this point, that their influence is being used for their own benefit. It's a form of rent seeking, but I suppose a very effective form of rent seeking, because it is the very people who present news to the public, and it's hard to get up a different opinion often in the media, just because the media is set to benefit here so much.
Yes, what they're doing, it seems to me, is they are monetizing what remaining influence they have over politicians. Murdoch, especially, has a lot of influence in Australia. He also owns the Times and Sunday Times in the UK, as well as the Sun and the Sun on Sunday, and also several major U.S. Dailies like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post. So he's hoping to, extend this Australian model to the UK. But I don't know. My recent book on the UK newspaper industry shows that newspapers there are making quite a successful transition to hybrid print online publications, especially Murdoch's newspapers, which he brought in a hard paywall about 2010, and from years of loss making at the Times newspapers, their profits have been doubling annually for the past few years, which is a rather a well kept secret over there. It's something you won't read about in the mainstream media. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, this is an intriguing point itself, which is the process of competition has and intense challenge to the news media industry has arguably led to actually quite substantial innovation. So the fact that the Times has put up a paywall, I think they probably improved the quality of their news output. The Guardian doesn't have a paywall, but they have a very aggressive system when you go to the Guardian where they say, please sign up to give a voluntary subscription. I think the Guardian, for the first time in many years, is now returning a surplus rather than taking away from its underlying trust. I mean, he's got this interesting thing here where you've got a whole bunch of innovation that's come out of the fact that they're struggling, or at least they were struggling, to convert to the digital age. But it seems the counter to that, which is if you accept that they should be getting these very large payments to digital platforms, you're going to reverse that innovation. You're going to discourage that kind of innovation. You're going to discourage them from being more nimble and innovative. And you're just going to make them dependent on the large digital platforms for their revenues. Or even more than that, you're making them dependent on politicians and legislators who are nice enough to create a system where they can benefit.
Yes, this is one of the concerns here in Canada is that while news media are evolving, the government has rather interfered in this evolution process. But here in Canada, our media are a bit of a mess, unfortunately, because of what we had here at the millennium in terms of convergence, which I don't believe was allowed in your country because you have limits on media ownership and this diversity test. Well, convergence in Canada at the millennium saw newspaper owners partner with television networks under this multimedia ownership model, which became overextended like the Empire of Rome. And within a decade, it collapsed. And unfortunately, some of our major newspaper chains have fallen into the clutches of US hedge funds and private equity, which are just simply milking them for all they're worth. They have no interest in journalism or even Canada. They're only interested in making money. And by my calculation, since 2010, the hedge funds have taken about 500 million Canadian dollars out of our largest uh, newspaper chain, now called Post Media Network. A $500 million could have paid for a lot of good journalism and transition to digital publication, which they still haven't been able to uh, muster. And now our second largest chain is owned by a private equity firm, Nordstar Capital, which is doing much the same. It's piecing off the company, stripping it of assets, and it's a terrible situation we have in Canada here. And my research in the UK shows that at least you have a much healthier news media ecosystem over there.
Yeah, and I think also you point out in the Canadian context, they've actually received a large amount of government subsidies in recent years as well. So these have been very effective lobbyists in that sense.
Yes, for the past 5 years here, we've had a federal bailout, which the publishers begged for $595 million over 5 years, but it expires in the spring. So after that, the publishers will be without visible means of support unless they can get on the Murdoch plan. But like I say, that seems to be backfiring on them. So we've got a big problem here, and we're going to have to do something about it. And I think we should take a serious look at a new system which would be less based on profit and more nonprofit organizations, and should be forward-looking and online focused rather than propping up, the dying corpse of print media.
Yeah, why do you think, just going back to the UK context where you say there is a bit of a stronger ecosystem, why do you think there's a similar demand for this kind of payments from digital platforms, even though there is this relative strength? And I wonder if you go a little bit more into that. What did you tell the Concus review a few years ago? I mean, if you could go into that a bit and what's happened since.
Well, like I say, newspapers are still, healthy there. They're well profitable, but they're not as obscenely profitable as they once were at the height of what I call the advertising bubble. It was like a license to print money, and so they've been having to downsize for the past 15 or 20 years. And if they could get their hands on some of the revenues from Google and Facebook, they would be back to their salad days of making obscene amounts of money. But I don't think that's going to happen, because I don't think Google and Meta are going to sit still to be fleeced in this manner.
Well, yeah, ultimately, it's a bit more of a complex mechanism in the UK context where they're going to have a debate about the respective value to each party and then decide whether or not they want to enter these agreements. And I think it'll be quite interesting to see whether or not the UK does go down the Canadian way and try to force it, only for it to backfire again, as we were saying.
Yes, it's the element of compulsion that bothers me, that the government would compel the digital giants to, subsidize legacy media if they want to enter into agreements, which, like I say, they have here in Canada. That's one thing, and I think the free market should should govern those. But for government to put its thumb on the scale, uh, I don't think is a very good idea. Like I say, the media are evolving, and I think that the government should do as much as it can to facilitate that evolution, and as a little as it can to block it.
Would you say, I mean, going back to the kind of central question of the podcast, I think you might have a more positive conclusion, which is the news media industry broken, or is it going to be surviving and succeeding in the future?
Well, I think we'll always have journalism, because there's a demand, on the behalf of the public to know what's going on, and there's also an impulse on the part of journalists to tell them what's going on and to explain it and to tell stories. But I think definitely the business model for news media is evolving. It always has through technology, but this has probably been the most disruptive technological change probably since Gutenberg, and the invention of printing.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate that. That's Marc Edge, who's the Canadian journalist, author, and academic. And if you're interested in learning more about Mark's work, you can read his recent blog post on the IEA website, or check out Mark's website where he writes all about these sorts of issues and the future of journalism. You can also check out the IEA's report, Breaking the News, which put this into the UK's context. If you're enjoying the IEA podcast, please do subscribe on your chosen podcast provider, and you can learn more about the IEA by visiting iea.org.uk.